Welcome to this afternoon session of Mind, Soul, World, Consciousness in Nature. My name is Jennifer Newsome Martin, and I am an assistant professor in the program of Liberal Studies with a concurrent appointment in the Department of Theology here at the University of Notre Dame. I have the very great pleasure of moderating this afternoon's session entitled The Soul and the Whole of Being. Before we begin this afternoon's session, I would like to express the Institute's great thanks to the John Templeton Foundation. It is due to their generosity and through a grant to the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study that we were able to make possible this Templeton Colloquium at the NDIAS. Biographies of all of our presenters and panelists this afternoon are available online on the Colloquium webpage of the NDIAS website. Paper copies of the presenters' biographies are also available, as you saw, on the table just outside of this room. For those just joining us or watching online from across the U.S., Europe, and beyond, first a few words about the Colloquium. This Colloquium was conceived of by Professor David Bentley Hart, one of this year's Templeton Fellows at the NDIAS. His goal was to bring together scholars from numerous disciplines and fields to examine critical topics about consciousness, including whether consciousness can evolve or emerge from matter, intentionality and the transcendental ends of consciousness, classical metaphysics of the soul, Eastern contributions to the understanding of consciousness, and the soul and the whole of being. His intent is to foster a broad, thorough, but less formal discussion, and to his credit, an objective of this colloquium is to have multiple and even divergent perspectives presented. This afternoon's session will have two parts as follows. First, we'll have our two presenters, William Desmond and Cyril O'Regan, present their thoughts on the soul and its relationship to the whole of being. Their presentations will be followed by David Hart, who has the option then of providing a brief response and commentary. The second component of this session will be the larger discussion for all of us here. This will include time for our questions and comments, as well as those from individuals watching this session via the website and posting the questions via the NDIAS email address. As you can see, this afternoon's presenters are William Desmond, Cyril O'Regan, and David Hart. William Desmond is Professor of Philosophy at Catholique Universitat Louvain, as well as David Cook Chair in Philosophy at Villanova University. He is the author of many books, including the trilogy Being and the Between, winner of the Prix Cardinal Mercier and the J. N. Finley Award for Best Book in Metaphysics, 1995 to 1997, Ethics and the Between in 2001, Art, Origins, Otherness, Between Art and Philosophy in 2003, Is There a Sabbath for Thought, Between Religion and Philosophy, 2005, God in the Between, 2008, The Intimate Strangeness of Being, Metaphysics After Dialectic in 2012, and the William Desmond Reader also in 2012. His most recent work includes the second edition of Desire, Dialectic, and Otherness, 2014, and The Intimate Universal, The Hidden Porosity Between Religion, Art, Philosophy, and Politics, which is forthcoming from Columbia University Press later this year. Cyril O'Regan is professor and the Catherine F. Husking Chair in Theology at the University of Notre Dame. He specializes in systematic and historical theology, and his work focuses on the intersection of continental philosophy and theology, religion and literature, mystical theology, and postmodern thought. The range of his publications includes such topics as the nature of tradition, the Trinity, negative theology, postmodern theology, Hegel as a theological source, and major religious figures. He is the author of The Heterodox Hegel in 1994, Gnostic Return in Modernity, 2001, Gnostic Apocalypse, Jakob Böhme's Haunted Narrative in 2002, and Theology and the Spaces Apocalyptic, 2009. His most recent work, of course, is his two-volume study of Hans Urs von Balthasar, The Anatomy of Misremembering, Balthasar and Hegel, Volume 1, and Volume 2 on Heidegger, forthcoming. David Hart is the recent holder of the Danford Chair at St. Louis University and currently serves as a Templeton Fellow at the NDIAS. He specializes in philosophical theology, systematics, patristics, classical and continental philosophy, and Asian religion. His most recent work focuses on the genealogy of classical and Christian metaphysics, ontology, the metaphysics of the soul, and the philosophy of mind. The author of many books and more than 150 articles, his most recent works include The Beauty of the Infinite in 2003, The Doors of the Sea, 2005, In the Aftermath, 2007, Atheist Delusions in 2009, and The Experience of God in 2013. In addition to his many prestigious fellowships and awards, in 2011, Professor Hart was awarded the Michael Ramsey Prize of the Church of England for theological writing. Please welcome our presenters, William Desmond, Cyril O'Regan, and David Hart.
First of all, my thanks to David Bentley Hart for the honour of the invitation and the pleasure and instruction of his work, and also of the stimulating papers and discussion by all the participants so far. Also, I'd like to thank the Centre for Advanced Studies and Grant Osborne and Don Steluto for their indispensable practical help in getting me here in any case. I haven't written a formal paper. I was responding to initial instructions to respond to David's orienting essay, which I read with great interest and admiration for the sweep of its ambitions. On the soul and the whole, my own thinking about the soul was significantly shaped by a conference in Oxford a number of years ago, in which I tried to put some words on the nature of the soul in the context of modernity, where the notion of the self seemed to have assumed a certain dominance. And one of the things that I realized in writing that paper was how different the sense of the ethos of being was in some of the pre-modern thinkers. They lived in the world differently, and particularly with reference to the stress on a certain univocal determinability in modernity, as well as a central theme in David's work, the mechanical picture that has taken a variety of different forms in modernity also, a different sense of the ontological ethos. Just as a small sign of that, I think of Aristotle's De Anima. De Anima is situated by Aristotle in the physics. So if De Anima and physics are intimately related to each other, clearly we're dealing with a different sense of ta physica, the physical things. I think that that's relevant in relation to the sense of nature in modernity and the place of soul, or the lack of a place of soul in that way of thinking about things. Looking at David's work in his recent book on the experience of God and in the orienting essay, as has been discussed briefly, he takes up more contemporary views, many reductionist and eliminationist. And I must say that I'm sometimes reminded of Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's travels to the island, the flying island of Laputa. And some of the fashionable theories about self and consciousness strike me as not entirely unlike those Laputan thinkers who seem so lost in their theories that they require flappers on the ear to get them to listen, flappers on the mouth to remind them that they can also speak. I have wondered whether David's work is the work of perhaps not a quite sympathetic flapper trying to bring those thinkers back to ground. As you know, those thinkers in Swift's savage satire, he has high praise for the wives of the Laputan thinkers. They're always trying to escape the flying island and go down to the earth. And one particular notorious case, a high-born woman runs off to the earth to essentially shack up with a drunken servant the nobles of the higher island go down to earth and drag her back. But in a very short time, she disappears once again back to the earth, and never more to be found with her drunken servant. Now again, perhaps David thinks that image is not charitable enough to his own sense of reductio ad absurdum, but I would say that on many occasions in reading his work in relation to some of these theories, I have the feeling that we're dealing with thinkers who, so to say, cut off their nose to spite their faces. And part of our task as thinkers is to return to the earth, put our feet back on the earth again. But what is the earth, of course? This is one of the questions about the nature of nature itself. So Cyril O'Regan and myself have been assigned a theme with almost hubristic associations attached to it: the soul and the whole of being. If I had a student asking me to supervise his or her thesis entitled "The Soul and the Whole of Being," I would secretly draw in my breath and gently suggest to the student, I think you need to be more determinate. Limit yourself to what can finitely be managed and take it from there. So all you wise teachers, treat me like that eager student. In 25 minutes, is that long enough to hold infinity in the palm of one's hand? Perhaps too long. So I thought I'd take two passes, so to say, at the theme. One dealing with a name that David gives to his own enterprise, his own project, namely the notion of theistic idealism. And I think the connection with the soul and the whole is very, very relevant here. Theistic idealism, often we tend to think of idealism itself as a philosophy of the whole. That is obviously most evident, I think, with the great idealist of the modern world, namely Hegel. But I was thinking of thinkers like early on O'Regan and later Berkeley, two Irish thinkers with whom I'm very happy to be in some way associated, but they are idealists of sorts, and their sense of given creation, O'Regan's work is called Perifusion, so the sense of nature, we're dealing with the physical things again, and it's clearly a sense of physis that is not the modern sense of nature. It's a theophanous sense of nature, and while there is an ideal dimension to it, it certainly is also concrete, so to say. It's a concrete idealism, and of course that word concrete is itself a word that we perhaps might look at more closely. Berkeley, and there have been a few remarks made about Berkeley, but Berkeley is, in my view, perhaps one of the most theophanous of thinkers in modernity. And to be is to be perceived, or to perceive. I think that is very germane to David's efforts to think the togetherness of mind and reality, of soul and the whole, of consciousness and the things themselves. In the case of Berkeley, of course, everything seems to become an idea. And one of the questions that raises itself for us is the precise status of matter. Again, as I understand Berkeley, he feared that in early modernity, certainly, matter was taking on the character of a rival absolute to the divine, even though in the sense of material substance, it was an I know not what. So it was something that could not be brought into relation with the perceiving mind. In the case of the outcome of his work, of course, one has to worry about the very status of matter at all. Berkeley, as you know, saw himself very much as defending Christian orthodoxy, but if matter itself seems to evanesce in the predominance of perception or idea, then one asks the question of how compatible that is with an incarnationalist religion. But the following point, I think that in idealism, and I can take Hegel as an exemplary here, if there is a God, it's a God of the whole. It's a God in which it's difficult to make a distinction between God and the whole. So in the case of Hegel, if there is a transcendence, it's an immanent transcendence, but a transcendence that in the end is configured in terms of what I would call an immanent holism. By contrast, I think when we ask about theism and the whole, I believe we have to talk about a God beyond the whole. The language of the whole is, of course, totally intimate to the entire metaphysical, perhaps theological tradition. And one of the images that we immediately recur to in thinking about the whole is the Parmenidean image of the sphere or the circle whose beginning returns to its end, and the circumference whose center is nowhere and whose the circumference is everywhere, center is nowhere. That sense of an enclosed totality. Again, I think this is an issue that we have to raise about whether holistic language is adequate to the sense of transcendence that is to be found within the monotheistic tradition. Whether, for that reason, we need to talk about a God beyond the whole, but a beyond that is not necessarily in dualistic opposition to a sense of the immanent whole. I think you could make the case that the tendency in there has been a strong tendency in the longer tradition to dualistically oppose immanence and transcendence in just those terms. But can we think of a transcendence beyond the whole that is not the opposite of a sense of the immanent whole? I think here the notion of the soul is very interesting, because just to take the human instance, soul, again, more in the pre-modern, let's say Aristotelian, and perhaps even common sense of soul, it refers us to the living integrity of a being. Integrity, of course, is a word of the whole. It's a singular whole, an integrity of being. But as a living integrity of being, there can be something open about that integrity. I have in various places talked about the notion of an open whole. But of course, from a purely univocal point of view, an open whole seems to be something like a contradiction in terms. If it's whole, it's closed in on itself. If it's open, then it's not a whole. But I think you could make the argument that in the case of the living human being or the living being, you do have an integrity of being, but that very integrity is also self-transcending. So again, to just recall Shawara's in and beyond, there's a sense in which the open whole allows a rich sense of immanence without, in any sense, being closed to what is beyond that immanent sphere. So if there is a holism, I think that we need to consider the question of whether soul asks of us a certain porosity to transcendence. The word porosity is important in the work that I do, a certain porosity of being in which the sense of the between, in a way, is more important than the sense of a whole. The danger with a whole is precisely that it becomes, again, a self-circling totality which is not open to anything that is beyond itself. Whereas a between, as opening the whole, is potentially porous to what is beyond the immanence of a certain finite holism, immanent holism, that doesn't have to lead us in the direction of a dualistic opposition between the immanent and the transcendent. Now again, whether rightly or wrongly, I take this to be close to the intentions that are at work in David Bentley Hart's writings. Let me just, this is the first pass, the soul and the whole, but idealism in modernity has many different forms, and just very briefly to talk about a subjective idealism. Berkeley is often said to be a subjective idealist, but I think that that is really not true. If one means by subjective a certain retraction into subjectivity, I think his so-called subjectivism, his theory of perception, even in the early work, where perceptions themselves are signs of divinity, in fact, already contains a sense of idealism that is not merely subjective. It's not merely objective either, since it points towards the divine spirit, which can't be simply reduced to any object or thing. Objective idealism is a suggestion put forward by some of the recent remarks by Thomas Nagel, as I understand them, coming from a standpoint that initially is certainly not sympathetic to any form of idealism, and yet the suggestion that there is a certain purposiveness at work, or at least the prefigurements or the promise of a kind of purposiveness at work as a possibility to be seriously entertained, points in that particular direction. But I wanted just a third kind of idealism, absolute idealism, of course, again identified with Hegel, but Schelling is important here. I think it's in some ways relevant to David's work in this sense that the terms of the subject and the object seem to point to something that is neither just the subject, not the object. If there's a togetherness, we have to, on the side of the subject, return back into sources that can't be just simply described in terms of subjectivity. If we're dealing with the objective, we also have to consider that objectivity is more than just the kind of neutral there-ness that seems to have become so widespread in the modern picture of things. And I think it's interesting to recall the project of the early Schelling here as in some ways not entirely unlike core desires of David. In the early work, Schelling tries to respond to Fichte, who wants to, in a certain sense, reconstitute the world from the standpoint of the ego. And the other to the ego is to be thought in terms of the self-activating ego. Whereas Schelling, under the influence of Spinoza, in fact, says that we not only have to go from the ego to the other than the ego, namely nature, but we also have to reconstruct a picture of nature which allows the possibility of the emergence of something like subjectivity. So the two sides have to be taken together by pointing to something that is neither one nor the other, and that both in their togetherness point to. In the orienting essay by David, I think in later parts of it, when he's talking about the transcendental and the transcendent, I think those two issues are at stake there. I'll come to this again a little bit in my second pass on the soul and the whole. But one last thing I just want to, on this first pass, talking about the sense of the whole in idealism, the sense of the beyond of the whole. I mentioned this earlier when talking about creation and nature. I think that we have to make a distinction between coming to be and becoming. Coming to be as the arising of being at all, and not simply the self-derivation of being. Becoming as a sense of the process within which we find ourselves, a process that in the case of human beings and perhaps other beings too can become a self-becoming. But the difference between coming to be and becoming is the following. To become, one must already be. So in other words, my argument would be that a becoming presupposes a coming to be, and thinking about coming to be puts us at a kind of threshold where what the theologians or the religious consciousness speaks of as creation becomes necessary for us. Something comes to be. Out of what does it come to be? Does it come to be out of the absolute principle, the divine? Does it come to be out of nothing, as in the orthodox monotheistic tradition? What does that mean? But one thing that it does mean is that the sense of the whole as closed in on itself in the idealistic picture of the whole is made porous. It can't be a closed whole. If to be is to receive being and to be received into being, already a certain porosity or permeability to what is more than that immanent whole is suggested. Okay, a second pass And there are a number of points here. Again, if one hasn't read the orienting essay, it perhaps may be a little less evident. But there's a very strong emphasis upon intentionality in the work of David, and I want to come to that and just raise a question or two about it. Not to reject it, but to ask about the context in which it is to be situated. But I take here again as a kind of motto, a hubristic motto, the claim by Aristotle that somehow the soul is everything. An extraordinary statement, difficult to interpret. Is the soul everything because as a knowing power it can take the form of all things? In previous discussion we talked about the form of the tree being in the tree, but also being in the knowing of the tree, and not necessarily in the same way in the knowing as in the tree itself. That notion of intentional presence in the knower is well thought in the Thomistic tradition, for instance. Or is this statement an ontological statement about the whole? Somehow the soul is everything, and that there is a certain enlivening, vitalizing, animating principle at work in our sense of the whole. Again, in the reading of Aristotle, that's not what's at issue here, but the sense of the whole is what's at issue, I think, again. One of the thinkers that David refers to on one or two occasions is Lonergan, and he there talks about the pure desire to know as unrestricted in its outreach, and he, again, very briefly connects that with the famous 18-step proof for God's existence as pointing towards an act of absolute understanding as the transcendent ground of all being. But there are two poles at work in some of his remarks, the notion of the transcendental and the notion of the transcendent. And when he talks about the transcendental, he doesn't intend it in a Kantian sense. He intends it in a non-Kantian sense. His proposal is not absolutely anti-Kantian in the sense that there is a certain turn to the self, as I understand it, suggested by his thinking. But I'm interested in the relation between the transcendental, as in some ways offering the enabling conditions, and the transcendent as naming something of the end or goal towards which the activation of these enabling conditions points. And again, I think this is very central in the perhaps more culminating phases of his work. And I might put it this way, that if you talk about the transcendental in this revised sense, what you're dealing with is a kind of archaeology. Now, again, I use archaeology here you're looking for a logos of the arche. So you're, in a certain sense, turned back towards origins and beginnings. Whereas if you're dealing with the transcendent, one tends to think that one is dealing with a teleology. It's a logos of the telos, that end towards which the unfolding in the middle is oriented. And the doctrine of intentionality seems to take place within those two extremes. And in David's text, there are a number of indications that those two extremes, they're in some ways points of vanishing into mystery. If we turn back, so to say, towards the soul and try to enter into it, there comes a threshold where, in fact, it's lost, so to say, in the depths of something that can't be made absolutely determinate by us. And similarly, at the other end, even though pure transparency between the knower and the knower is said to characterize God, there's a certain hyperbolic character to that transparency, which seems to have a certain exceeding character that again can't be made purely determinate. So my question is this about intentionality as in that middle space, and a lot of attention is given to intentionality. And I'm wondering whether, in fact, one can give too much attention to intentionality without enough time spent on the archaeology of the sources of selving, so to say. The sense of the soul as tapping into mysterious roots in nature, perhaps beyond nature, but not necessarily appearing determinately within the more forwardly directed movement of intentionality. Intentionality is a medieval doctrine arriving in phenomenology through Brentano and on to Husserl. And indeed, I think Heidegger's doctrine of being in the world is a kind of souped up version of intentionality, in which the effort is to give it some ontological flesh, so to say. But my question really is whether one can so privilege teleology that one doesn't do justice to archaeology. And I will indicate why I think we need archaeology in that sense. Now, again, I'm not arguing for someone like Marion, who seems to want to evacuate the subject in order to open up a space for the saturated phenomenon and so on, though I think it's a question that he would put to an intentionality that is so strongly oriented teleologically. And again, just a brief reference to my own work. I have tried to talk about what I call a certain porosity of being. I mentioned that already in connection with the notion of an open hole, the between as a certain opening or threshold between immanence and transcendence. But if I'm not wrong, it seems to me that in modernity, in looking at the self, we have very strongly emphasized that forward sense of self-surpassing. And one of the words that gives expression to that in quite a number of discourses is the notion of the conatus essendi. The conatus essendi as, again, an affirmation of being, an endeavor to be, a striving to be oneself fully. So you can see how that could be refined and reformulated in relation to certain teleologies. It doesn't have to be identified either with Hobbes or Spinoza, to be sure. But I try to argue that we have to conceive of what I call a passio essendi, a patience of being, and that there's a sense of this passio which is more primordial than the conatus essendi, that this being received into being, being received as being at all, is always presupposed in all of our endeavors to be. And of course, if you like, the elan of life is to move forward in respect of the conatus essendi, such that the patience of being, this original being given to be, is easily forgotten in our living of the gift of being itself. So at the archaeological level, I think that a rethinking of the soul, and I think also a rethinking of consciousness, has to somehow open up space for this patience of being, this porosity of being, and open it up not as a kind of empty tabula rasa. Again, this is a locution that often appears, that the mind is not merely passive. That is true, but there could be a patience of being that isn't a mere passivity, that is to be juxtaposed with a certain self-activating endeavor to be. And I do think that we have a tendency to tilt towards the second and forget about the first. But if we forget about the first, very easily the endeavor to be then simply becomes a relentlessly reiterated process of self-determination, in which our self-becoming and the self-becoming of the whole becomes the whole. So the sense of coming to be, the sense of the givenness of being, the sense of creation in the theological sense begins really to make no sense if the tilt is so strongly in that particular direction. If I could connect what I'm saying here with some remarks this morning, I'm thinking of the notion of the verum et factum principle, factibilitas. I would try to argue that, yes, we make, but the meaning of making is inseparable from endowed powers. And the fact that our powers of making are themselves endowed, the notion of an endowment carries the meaning of a gift. Something is already given. And true making in some way or other has to remain in respect of that original giving. I think actually, if you go back to Aristotle, his phrase again, I'm more a Platonist than an Aristotelian, but I seem to be speaking Aristotle today. Art completes nature. Art completes nature, but not because art and nature are simply opposed to each other. There's, so to say, an art at work in nature already prior to our art. And true human art would, in some deep sense, be intimate with this prior art of nature, this prior poiesis of nature, if one could call it that. But that prior poiesis would take us back to secret sources of being creative that can't be fitted into the logic of our self-determination, and that also are at times not easily fitted into a discourse of intentionality. Something else is at work even when we are intentionally in pursuit of ends. And that something other, of course, is very easy to forget. So, okay, the soul and the whole too. So I'll try to conclude with a few remarks. Do they bring these strands together? They bring them a bit closer. Coming back to theism and idealism, during our discussions and reading the orienting essay, the figure of Hegel came back to me again and again. And Hegel has an interesting definition of reason in the phenomenology. It comes sort of midway: consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, and spirit. But the opening claim about reason is the conscious certainty of being all reality. Now, there are statements made by David which they're not meant in a Hegelian sense, but they come very close to that in relation to the telos towards which he is orienting himself. Lonergan, the pure desire to know, again, that sense of unrestricted desire to know, needing as its answer qua telos, an unrestricted act of understanding identified with God. Lonergan is obviously not Hegel, but my question would be, what does the word pure mean in pure desire to know? Lonergan's pure desire to know is itself, it seems to me, very much inflected by this intentional movement forward. But what the desire is qua pure is, to me, somewhat unclear. Perhaps, in fact, what we need is something like a purgation of desire that might return us to what earlier I was talking about as the porosity or the patience of being, which again I think if one takes into account it's not that one gets rid of the forward movement, but it becomes a different balance between receiving and being active. There's another, again going back to Aquinas and Aristotle, Lonergan talking about the intellect, citing potens omnia facere et fieri. He, in his verbum articles, but elsewhere also, that the intellect somehow is the potency or the power to make all things and to become all things. Now again, I'm not taking issue with that in terms of the soul being all things, but it seems to me that the inflection of the phrase is teleologically oriented rather than archaeologically oriented in the sense that I'm trying to communicate. To make all things and to become all things, rather than in the case of the human being being already endowed with an open power that is in promise porous to all that is, all that can be, and indeed open to the divine. So if it is empowered, or intellect or mind, it is as endowed, as an enabled potency, and not just simply as a simple potens omnia facere et fieri. So before facere et fieri, there is this prior ontological porosity, and my question is also whether we need to take into account something of this prior with respect to intentionality also. I'm going to finish with a citation from Aquinas, I've been carrying around this piece of paper. Somehow it found its way into my pocket. You can see how it's not quite Pascal's memorial. I haven't quite stitched it into my jacket yet, but it's fairly worn. I don't know why I'm carrying it around, but I happen to be carrying it around. It's from his commentary on the sentences, and I think it's a marvelous number of words which show Aquinas to be a master of old things, archaic things, but also to be extraordinarily contemporary in relation to some more recent movements in continental philosophy of religion. So let me just read this. So Aquinas, when therefore we proceed towards God by way of remotion, we first deny of him anything corporeal, and then we even deny of him anything intellectual, accordingly as these are found in creatures, such as goodness and wisdom, and then there remains in our mind only the notion that he is, and nothing more. Wherefore he exists in a certain confusion for us. Lastly, however, we remove from him even being itself, as it is found in creatures, and then he remains in a kind of shadow of ignorance, by which ignorance, insofar as it pertains to this life, we are best united to God. So this is, to me, a marvelous statement of a kind of sacred ignorance, almost a kind of holy idiocy. Is it closer to the pure porosity, the purged porosity? We are not there, and yet we have never been more there. We are most exposed and most recipient, most getting out of the way, and most truly on the way. Thank you.
First, my gratitude for the invitation, for this exhilarating and mind-expanding, but not only mind-expanding heart topic, for putting me also in contact with my Irish friend, William, whose phenomenologically based metaphysics of the between helps us to get purchase on the topic that is at the utmost reaches of David's current investigation, which in his other works he has dared to chart. I'm going to read Soul World, that directionality, under the auspices of World Soul, hyphen, as that which might be hypothesized to hold all matter and all consciousness and all forms of matter and all forms of consciousness together. This which is something of a conceit, but I think it brings other dimensions to the discussion that we might not have had so far, although I think it would be stretching things to say it's going to make them more clear. There is a gratitude proviso. William and I, of course, have been assigned a theory of everything. And of course, I am tempted in a way that perhaps William Weiser is not, to cover the entirety of what is from subatomic particles of the universe, to explain the general laws of matter, to speak to transitions from matter to inorganic, organics, or to conscious and self-conscious life. And in doing so, of course, I would value contingency, difference, complexity, connectivity, which holds together, what holds together everything, and what makes one, despite all that differentiate, pulls away that is anarchic, exceptional, entropic, and all does not seem to want to belong or to make sense. I would do all of that, except I think Paul Griffiths is in the room. Which gives one a kind of sense of the infinite qualitative vulnerability, so there's no of a person. That does remind me, sort of, to get back to the beginning, with David Bentley Hart. I think Flann O'Brien, the great Irish philosopher, was put sort of at the center. And I'm sure this is an apocryphal story, because Flann O'Brien's life sort of knows a mess, and therefore apocryphal stories abound. But I do believe so that once upon a time there was a post-Trinity College student. It's not clear how long he lasted, a weekend and so forth. He probably was a dub. but he affected various mannerisms which would go more nearly with an Oxford Don. But one evening, these mannerisms included the following frightening phrase: "It occurs to me." Father Brian put an end to that. "I wish it didn't." I'll get back to Paul. I should point out that here, the world soul, or soul of the world, that we come naturally on the question of God, or at least how God actually or possibly leaks into our discourse. Now, of course, there are a number of responses or choices, and we actually do have choices. We can observe the leakage and just let it be. We can either have or put in place procedures to contain or remove the leakage of God. We don't have to talk about God. Or we can welcome God into our discourse and try to determine God's place and role. And with that comes the problem of how to name his appearance or his quite determinate hiding. Now, what I really want to talk about is that it does seem to me, and this, of course, will be too genealogical for some folks, that even when now we talk about all these questions, there's a sense in which our discourse will be rigged. So I'm talking about the rigging of discourse, where we'll automatically fall when we talk about these things, if in fact we dare to talk about them at all. So given the haunting both by the responsibility of the theory of a whole and the locution of the world soul itself, that is, we're no longer talking about personal consciousness, and the prospect, at least, of the appearance or intimation of God, is difficult not to bring into our conversation German idealism, Hegel in particular, and Romanticism, both of whom presumed, very interestingly, to be picking up, in most cases, a Neoplatonic trope of the world soul, precisely because they didn't like the form of moribund Christianity, and the God of Christian theism that David Bentley Hart would want and enjoy. Now, once we open up the issue, such as the interconnection of material consciousness now on this vast universal scale, and once we start speculating regarding the interconnectivity of everything, then we're both carrying also German idealism and Romanticisms, we're carrying their eclectic ideological train into our very, very modern intellectual environment. Moreover, it is possible also that one or other of both of these discourses, which I actually think are grammars, not proper names, might encourage or discourage theistic idealism or idealistic theism, if we want to call it that. But perhaps actually we might want to call that which we might want to distinguish from both, maybe, and maybe I'm thinking of John Milbank here, could we not call it also, given that we are talking about matter, mattering, maybe we should talk about it as a theistic materialism. After all, why should it be the case that we cannot have property rights, on materialism and so forth? I want to recur to worries that I think were raised this morning in the conversation between John Milbank and Paul Griffiths. And the context of this, of course, is that any discourse we have with respect to world soul or anything got to do with the general theory of the whole does occur now in modernity or after modernity, or we're dealing with modernity whether we want to or not. And that means that if all of us are tired of or think that naturalism, materialism will not do, then of course that we're put in a position of contraposition, and the contrapositions that are grammatically laid down do seem to me to be either German idealism or some form of Romanticism. Let me just make a remark about John, or actually John and I, since I think we probably belong together in some which way. We exhibit a genealogical style and are substantively fellow travelers in that we would advocate a participatory metaphysics which is theologically consummated in a dynamic perichoretic trinity. I think we tend to agree on all of that. But as we trawl the past from the vantage point of now, for discourses, practices that might heal us of the real or perceived wounds of modernity that inhibit or disallow participation, thereby preventing us from being the participatory subjects we think we should be, discrimination is at a premium. As one who has fished Neoplatonic, theurgic, and hermetic waters, I can assure you that there are some strange beasts. And even the ones that are not so strange need to be tamed. It's not simply the worry about eclecticism, it's the worry about whether or not the principle of selection might turn out in the end to be the principles of German idealism and romanticism, and their way of retrieving discursive systems from the past. More holistic than our modern ones, broader in scope, more enfleshed, while also more confident of our participation in the divine and our belonging together in the divine. If the ultimate criterion is that one should support everything that modernity denies, besides some ingratitude to modernity, which probably won't bother us, there is a danger that we flatten and bring back that which might be better off dead. The umbilicus might be a flashpoint. But perhaps so the Hermetic text, like a text like Asclepius, maybe we might do better not bringing that back. Well, that might be quite the same as bringing back the gospel of truth, and I am going to vote against that. With regard to Paul, John, like myself, of course, can get it wrong. We rarely do, of course, precisely by too much genealogy. But what about Paul, who eschews it? Now, I know quite a few German Romantic writers, though unfortunately here Kleist is not one of them, although I have read the marionette piece somewhere. Paul is not doing exegesis, I got that. Kleist is merely illustrative as Paul goes about a deflationary program based upon the stipulative definition of consciousness, which essentially involves a subject-object relation. However, I would submit that in his comments, Paul himself was theologically inflationary at one point, and that another used Wittgenstein to flatten what was likely an inflationary point in Kleist. Paul as the theologically inflationary person. Paul was theologically inflationary when he reads Kleist so that we can and perhaps should think of the fall as a fall into consciousness. This is purchased at a price which I'm not sure he thought he was paying. He is at once denying Augustine, whom he serves at least on some occasions, who suggests we fall into sinful exclusiveness, which perpetuates itself, and also violence. Although Paul is not interpreting Kleist, instead of Christianity, he offers us a view of the fall that is romantic and idealist to the core. The fall into consciousness is a fall into the narrowing of consciousness defined otherwise. So says Schiller, so says Schlegel, so says Schelling. Oh, and yes, so says Hegel. Yes, Hegel again. Throughout his works, Hegel actually offers an interpretation of the Genesis account of the fall, not as a fall into sin, but a fall into knowledge, subject-object bifurcation, and thus alienation, and thus the repetition. Hegel is convinced that we can't go back, that we must go forward to a super-consciousness that overcomes the split. We can achieve that without heaven, or actually perhaps this is what heaven looks like. There's a lot more idealism and romanticism here, I fear, than Wittgenstein, and a lot more than is claimed in the Christian tradition. Though it is true, the following is true, and I will grant this. In the last ecstasy in the Paradiso, the subject-object differentiation will go as we go into the perichoretic Trinity. But I also take it that it's Dante's very Augustinian point that much more would have to have gone by before that is possible, and that is actual. I think I'll skip sort of into the second point. That's probably the Paul theological inflationary probably, I think, will do that particular job. Paul loves controversy, so I decided so that we'll give it to him somewhat. I want to talk more about Hegel, whom none of us seem to be able to avoid. And my point about Hegel is not so that all need to become Hegel scholars. It is that once you actually expand the domain of question, then he becomes unavoidable because he has already set answers in place for you. One difference between great and not so great philosophers is that despite your fervent wishes, it is well nigh impossible to totally ignore or eradicate them. Torch, bleach, poison, they keep coming back. This is especially true of Hegel over and over again, whether the issue is sensation, perception, or consciousness, or the shaping force of institutions, or the nature and historical role of art and religion. Hegel can make a guest appearance at least on all of those issues, some but not all by invitation. But he is almost constrained to come in when we raise questions of shared consciousness and how that is mediated through human constructions or institutions at particular places and times, and over time. And when we raise the issue of whether we can define the conceptual metaphysical matrices that enable us to map the entire world and have conceptual protocols in place for shifts in and beyond material base, and a language that can control all regional languages. And Hegel is with us again when the God question arises out of our attempt to map the complex, differentiated whole, accounting for vertical shifts in areas of inquiry and also completeness of discourse. I suppose what I want to say is that we should raise questions such as the one that David arrives at, but postpones. We will almost necessarily be dealing with Hegel and the kinds of post-Kantian mapping of individual and community experience along synchronic and diachronic axes we find in the phenomenology, the kind of rewriting of logic or metalogic we find in the science of logic, and the account of the world that includes matter, consciousness, and pan-consciousness, despite commentators' attempts to translate Hegel into English. One comes upon the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, the point sort of the view from nowhere, which of course is the view of everything from nowhere. All I want to do is make placeholder points. In fact, actually even less than that. Clearly, this is not the place to give a detailed exposition of the above. I'm not even convinced this is the place to give even placeholder descriptions of the experiential and conceptual mapping ambitions, none greater than which can be thought. I simply want to make a few general points. Hegel and his BFFs, Schelling and Hölderlin, were aficionados of Henkai Pan. Any particular version wouldn't make any difference. Ancient or modern, performative, that's real living or ideational, term of philosophical discourse, non-Platonic, Heraclitus or Spinoza, or Platonic or Neoplatonic, Plotinus, Proclus, perhaps also Bruno. For Hegel and Schelling, the one all is a kind of fundamental intuition that requires articulation and justification. Secured in Hegel's text, second point, is an expansive notion of grades of consciousness and interpenetrating consciousness, which is given the name of Geist or spirit or all-mind. All-mind would not sort of be the worst translation. And also the articulation of complex intermediations of reality in the web of discourse or discourses, complex and subtle enough to render it. Now, whatever the varieties of sentimental Hegelianism, which insists that Hegel could not have meant what he said about the mapping of experience is complete, that the conceptual mapping is complete. They are at odds with Hegel, who had the chutzpah to claim just that. In fact, he insists, after Spinoza, that such a requirement of completeness is a requirement of science. Now, needless to say, this does not correspond, and perhaps unhappily does not correspond, to the procedures of science we know, or Kant's validation of the architectonic view of science that he proposes at the end of the Critique of Pure Reason. Now, Hegel, thirdly, is convinced of the unavoidability of the God question, even when he's not talking about Christianity. Although, as we all know, in his view, Christianity is entitled to inordinate respect, since it, maybe unbeknownst to itself, provides a symbolic and narrative code that is to be cracked by Hegelian philosophy. So just remember, Hegelian philosophy not only cracks seriatim, notions like creation or incarnation, but also the Trinitarian code, which, though it might seem initially beside the point, is, as it turns out, the code that regulates everything else. So why are a lot of philosophers of religion or theologians talking about the Trinity? Well, obviously they have confessional interest in it. But also, in fact, Hegel sort of has invaded the discourse. He has a very, very particular view, not merely of the Trinity, but also the relationship sort of between how we talk about it in terms of representation within religion and how we ought to talk about it. That is sort of, in some sense, as part of a conceptual matrix. How do we respond to Hegel, who bleeds into our discourse, who determines it beforehand, who is nipping at our ankles, and who actually lowers the ceiling with respect to how we are going to talk about things? Well, of course, answering Hegel can be spoken of in many ways too. There's clearly the option of the run-of-the-mill avoidance. We can qualify aspects of Hegel's account, whether sense, perception, understanding, and so forth, or we can complain about his performative and ideational violence with regard to finitude. Other attacks are more fundamental, such as that of Heidegger, who, of course, in his later work might himself be a kind of Henkai Pan artiste. Derrida's giant act of refutation of Hegel on the plane of experience, which issues in the Talmudic text Gla, and maybe even Deleuze, who, inspired by both American pragmatism and its metaphysical pluralism, and a certain Spinoza, that of course is Spinoza as chastened by Leibniz monadology and rung through the energetics of Nietzsche. Or perhaps also Alain Badiou, who works with and corrects Hegelian logic in ways that are more favorably disposed to contingency and particularity, but also in ways that tend to think of transformation in the rules that govern domains, making rules products of the very elements they're supposed to rule. Actually, in answering, I'm going to say something about my friend, who is sitting down. And just say something about his resistance to Hegel, which does not obviously constitute his whole theoretical apparatus or vocation. But I want to make 3 points that he has made in other works. You answer Hegel by having, 1, more phenomenological adequacy. You should or ought to point to the givenness of enfleshed selves in community with other enfleshed selves, in an enveloping world of sense and perception, from which we ultimately find ourselves precipitated to the differentiation of individual and communal consciousness and the symbols and narratives of their expression, which are not always fully translatable into a conceptual idiom. The whole is intended in all the levels of consciousness, but it remains beyond their sum. Symbols and narratives provide something of a limit. I suppose this suggests that Husserl is realized in Merleau-Ponty and not in the Cartesian meditations. 2, got to do with matrices. Metaxological metaphysics, or metaphysics of the in-between. Here, responsibility is taken for mapping of the whole of experience and what is intended in experience. First, more regional wholes, which regulate relations and are regulated by them. And then the whole of wholes, which likely is an open whole. It's a kind of left-wing Hegelian criticism that routinely Desmond lodges against Hegel. Unlike in the case of Hegel, difference and the irreducibility of individuals are central. In an attempt to avoid the absolute split between the supernumerary and instances in his grounding first volume, Desmond avails of the term community to mean the belonging together of individuals in relation, and possibly different kinds of relation, also different levels of relation. And lastly, there's something he says about God, which is important for us, that when we talk about the whole, we may or may not be talking about God, we may or may not be able to make them move, or may in fact get confounded. In God in the Between, Desmond advises us to acknowledge the insistence of the God question in mapping experience and conceptuality. Whether at the reflective or unreflective level, there's an obvious tendency, he suggests, towards what we might generically call pantheism. The judgment is not negative. A case can be made for pantheistic tendency against every particular reflective form of thought, that at least those ones which are naturalistic and materialistic. but also, I suppose, over against those what would be also spiritualistic. Desmond provides a pantheism advisory. Experiential pantheism is not only ineluctable, it is innocent. Not so, however, the reflective forms, such as that illustrated by German idealism in general and Hegel in particular. Here, Hen quite deliberately becomes a function of Pan. This links this exploratory work in God, as God presents God's self in a variety of different kinds of experience, with different ratios of reflection, to Desmond's polemic against God's self-differentiating, self-conjugating whole, which not only seems to rhyme with the Christian God, who is properly transcendent as well as immanent. In fact, however, Hegel's speculative construction manages to counterfeit Christianity. Hegelian triacity differs toto cello from the Christian God of the Trinity. I have said many similar things myself about Hegel, but why objectify myself when I can objectify a friend? I will subjoin to that an O'Regan question. Let's suppose that we can think of Hegel, among other things, as being the greatest of modern panpsychics. I suppose that one might go further than that, insofar sort of as that it's not just simply that. It's not just simply he has something like a world soul. In fact, he actually talks about a world soul. But he also has something like nous. And I take it sort of that the commitment to both is not necessarily sort of without its own conceptual confusions. I take it if you only had a commitment to the world soul, it's very difficult to get to a transcendent God, sort of who we want to claim is not material in any which way. And so therefore I suppose sort of that Hegel sort of does need a bridge. And the bridge I suppose is nous. And the bridge I'm supposing to be nous is not necessarily sort of that I'm making sort of a kind of wild interpretive claim. Hegel actually sort of in the history of philosophy sort of does suggest with respect to Plotinus, with respect to Proclus, and even with respect to Philo, that essentially sort of what he is talking about is that the whole world sort of is the world of Suke, but Suke of course itself is a product of nous. But as Suke is a product of nous, nous is not a product of anything else. And nous sort of now is also not, it's liminally non-personal. Clearly, therefore, we're going to have either the problem of we cannot get to God because of the world soul, and there's nothing in between. If we have nous, we cannot get to God simply because we can't sort of get to the personal God, and we have an ideational space, shall we say, a logical matrix, or at least equivalent of a logical matrix, which is self-sustaining. I just want to say sort of something about Romanticism as the second kind of development when I think we find so we want to talk about something grand like the whole, and we want to talk about it without dismissing matter at all. Let's agree that one of the things that we have in modernity is that when sort of we are against naturalism and materialism, this does not mean necessarily, this is why it means what David is doing sort of does not follow automatically. It does not mean somehow that we're against those things that sort of we're for traditional forms of theism or even any reformulation of those. In fact, usually is the case we're not. There is a massive desirability with respect to something like an immanent transcendence. That sort of should sort of function sort of as the way in which sort of we get out of, the way in which we grow, the way sort of in which sort of we ourselves can invest ourselves as well as nature as a whole with some manner or transcendence. Let me just say a few remarks about Romanticism, and I'll specify it sort of by talking sort of about, talking about Americans and Irish today, it looks like. And I'm going to talk about Emerson just ever so briefly. Romanticism is with us whether we like it or not, because I think it's a grammar. I don't think it's necessarily just simply sort of back in the 18th century. And the features of German and English Romanticism, and also so the many reformulations of it, is that we have a kind of ideological event that cuts across genres on the one hand, buckles distinctions between poetry and prose, but also literature and philosophy, and even philosophy in actions, a kind of revolutionary discourse. But it is also, and importantly, against naturalism. It's against naturalism in material and material in principle, and also in terms of its real-life consequences. So most of the romantics also sort of are social critics with respect to all kinds of things. So they are sort of Karl Marx largely before Karl Marx. But also, for our point of view, they are, either happily or unhappily, against supernaturalism too. They're against miracle as the interruption of nature, against the correlative blind faith and bibliolatry, against a God who, they think, arbitrarily creates and issues divine commands. And therefore, we can say that Abrams really did get it right in terms of nailing down definition, that Romanticism is a form of natural supernaturalism, or supernatural naturalism, whichever you go. It's a synthetic view. The natural is sacralized, so it's not just simply natural or reducible, and the sacred is brought down to earth and also democratized. But as that happens, ancient traditions, this should tell us an awful lot, come into play. Because what we're going to do is we're going to set up legitimation procedures. We're going to do something that's contra-modern, but then so we're looking for our own energy, yes, but also we're looking for arms. We're looking for armaments with respect to how we might do it. For those who dared before us to talk in these ways which were forbidden to talk and so forth. These traditions run the gamut in a figure like Blake, we can imagine. The Platonic and Neoplatonic views on the anima mundi as cosmic mind rooted in matter was a favorite of just about all the Romantics, certainly Wordsworth or Tintern Abbey, the early Coleridge, and of course Shelley. The later non-poetic Coleridge, of course, while remaining sympathetic to the pantheistic protocol, does try to correct in ways that leave space for more Christian kind of transcendence, and who also will articulate in a mode of logic that opens on what might be called, or perhaps begins with God. But the person I want to say, because I think I can assume a certain knowledge here, is Emerson. Now, Emerson is the one who wrote his poetry and discoursed, wrote poetry which performed and also discoursed about it in his various texts. The poet, which is the emblematic human, that is, what we are or should be, is that person who sees nature as real symbol, that is, nature renders concretely what is more than nature, understood simply as an organization of matter. Nature is pan, nature is whole. And he underscores the purpose is to deny the transcendent God. We have to have, he thinks, a proper description of what we're going to do to replace both matter on the one hand and the transcendent God, who probably, in his view, provoked materialism. We have to get, and we have to reimburse ourselves with a kind of perennial philosophy that includes Plato, Plotinus, Iamblichus, Proclus, Heraclitus, Pythagoras, Boehme, Swedenborg, and a few others as well. The question, I want to repeat the Hegel problem. Can you get to God if you commit to the world soul? Do you need the personal God if you have nous? And points to the other question of how to read the relation between the equivalence between nous and Sukkah in Romantics, even though they are not in the business of solving large-scale philosophical and theological issues. To say a brief word about the relation to pantheism, I'm coming towards a close. In fact, I think I can leave that out. How to respond? Or actually ask a more primitive question, whether one would think that one would need to respond to Neoplatonism. And I want to end by suggesting a historical figure who might be the figure for us with respect to trying to mediate or ameliorate problems that arise when we do actually want to talk about the whole, and we do want to talk about the whole by respecting materiality and so forth. And I want to turn to an old reading of mine, which I have not done for many, many years, and that's Hosea Royce. I have not thought of him or Bradley since my Hegel days, or in fact before. Now, the three prompts that made me think of Royce. First of all, that he thinks that we have to deal, if we have the problem, if we have the interest in the whole and we have the interest in the relation of matter to more than matter, we will necessarily have to talk our way through idealism and romanticism. That's one good reason why he should be read. Second, he thinks that we need to engage Hegel because Hegel engages and will engage us whether we like it or not when we get to a notion of experience, when we get to the notion of mapping, when we get to the notion of God. And also, of course, there is the way in which, in Royce's thought, there's a directionality from consciousness, social consciousness, to consciousness that is developing, and ultimately sort of talk about God, which seems to be sort of the way in which the program was set up by David Bentley Hart. All of this, I think, sort of is laid out in the world and the individual. Now, the final point sort of is the one and only point that I have been making. To talk sort of in, or to be asked the question in the grand way that we have been asked, that's William and I, is on the one hand to understand that if we're talking about world soul, or any other substitute of world soul, if we're talking about the whole, and if we're talking about the whole when the whole is in fact the whole, the theory of everything, God will come in. But if God comes in, there's a way sort of in which there are two grammars available which we might speak whether sort of we know it or not. So my view sort of of looking, the way in which I look at romanticism and idealism, not merely sort of as particular discourses on the one hand, but as grammars. Two, as they're discourses which themselves pick up things for the past, whereby sort of they're going to use those things against materialism. They will function in that particular sense as friends of Thais. But they are, I would want to submit, extraordinarily dangerous friends, which forbid quite as much as they permit. And they're forbidding because it is subtle and because they've given us so much that we need. Always seems sort of less tangible than materialism that we would like to refute. Thank you.
Thank you both for those elegant, provocative papers. David, would you like to respond?
I would, but I'm going to alter the pattern slightly, if I may, because I'm on a strict medication schedule, and I stupidly left the medicine in my car outside. So if someone else could start the conversation,
Sounds great.
I'll be back in 5 minutes, and I'll imperiously seize the mic.
That sounds great. All right, John.
Not to be selfish, but since I have to teach in 10 minutes, I might just quickly get a couple of questions in. My first question is, in what way could you say, to address to both of you, that theology has to navigate between Hegel and the phenomenology, the whole is the true, and Adorno and Minimum Moralia, the whole is the untrue? This is more of a prize essay question, I suppose, but I thought I'd pose it to you, given how much I think of your ability to answer it. Anyway, my second question is to address to William. I took to heart and really appreciated what you said about the Passio Ascendi, as you had it, being in some sense more original than the Conatus Ascendi. So I wondered whether one could work with Paul's verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 about glory to glory, being transformed from glory to glory. That initially one might say that there is a glory of being, a glory of just being, right? And in that, to use the Shivara idiom, in that sense one might speak of essence in existence, that being the glory of this particular thing, or simply of just being. Hexeitas might even come to mind there. But then, on the other hand, in more of an eschatological key, the glory of being fully in Christ. And then to use the Shivaran idiom, of essence beyond existence, in that sense. This being the ultimate horizon of all creation. A wonderful pericope here, I was just discussing with Janet earlier, from 1 John chapter 3, Beloved, we do not yet know what we are, but when he appears we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. So I wondered whether that would precisely capture, the glory to glory, could precisely capture the being in between creation and eschaton. So those are the two questions.
Let me just say something about the first question. Our second question is Williams, and I'm going to sort of also see the first question as well, by and large. In a way, sort of, I've made myself redundant for answering the question in the sense that I've set the platform sort of for the answer in any event. I did want to say, hopefully I said, that whether sort of we're talking about epistemology or metaphysics, and especially sort of, when sort of we're talking sort of about wholes, Hegel is going to be our companion. And therefore the kinds of claims that he makes, the claim, for instance, of the whole sort of is the true and so forth, then those are the kind of claims that will tend to get repeated. We will not need an outside respect, so that we'll have a part whole, rather than sort of that as an immanent and transcendent, and beyond sort of the whole, there's going to be sort of something else. Now, the only remaining issue sort of is what's the status sort of the Adorno-like denial of the above, right? Obviously, Christians can use anything for any particular purpose. So I myself sort of have used Adorno with respect sort of to crack sort of Hegel, as I've used Derrida to crack Hegel. I've used any kind of person to crack Hegel. So we all instrumentalize and we all sort of kind of function tactically. But I would say that just straight up, if you're thinking sort of Adorno, Adorno sort of straight up is basically a product of Hegel himself. That is, it's a whole-scale rejection. The whole-scale rejection is pre-programmed. It is not an actual deflation of the claims of Hegel. It's another inflationary claim with respect to the opposite. So in one sense, if Hegel were around, or real Hegelians are around, then what has been suggested sort of is the beginning of the phenomenology. The phenomenology is there. That which makes no sense, right? There's nothing which really makes more sense. There are things which appear to make more sense. But every third is not quite a third. Every third is the possibility of intelligibility. He's played into the hands. Hegel has set the entire agenda. Everything that is not Hegel's agenda is not on the table. That is, and that sort of is, if you like, a so-called really good thinker, not being a great thinker, being a weak thinker, because what he says is exclusively determined, constitutively determined by Hegel.
Hegel, the true is the whole. I must say that I'm quite sympathetic to the sentence qua sentence, but for me it has to do then with how he works out the sense of the whole. And it becomes a self-determining whole, which in the end, I think, closes the circle on itself. And if you can rescue wholeness, I think you can rescue wholeness. It doesn't have to be that self-returning whole. It can be a self-exceeding whole of the in and beyond sense that you were talking about also. But I think that, the notion of wholeness, 30 years ago I introduced the notion of wholeness in connection with Hegel's aesthetics, and the Hegelians were very happy with that. But among the deconstructionists, to talk about any sense of wholeness was immediately, anathema. Now, somewhere between Hegel's totalizing wholeness and the anathema of wholeness, but I wouldn't put it in those terms simply. With Adorno, the true is the unwhole, or the whole is the untrue. He's a dialectical thinker, but as a negative dialectical thinker, he takes the energy of negation that is present in Hegel's way of thinking and simply, as it were, it's like a coitus interruptus, so to say. He won't go through with the act, which might point towards the generation of a new whole. But then when he brings in the promise of utopia, it seems to me that is in the family, it's in the same family of trying to dream a kind of possibly eschatological whole. So I think that has been a dominant strategy in quite a lot of the post-Hegelians. They want to use the power of negativity as critique to deconstruct wholes, but unchaining it from the orientation towards any sense of any whole. And Hegel, I think, has something to say on that particular score that we should listen to in terms of trying to rehabilitate some sense of wholeness. Second question, a very difficult question, but just a thought that struck me is the notion of the porosity as a certain opening up of space and the sense of a certain kenotic patience, so to say, through which glory streams. So glory to glory would strangely look like nothing in one sense, but the radiance would be there in what at some level appears almost as if it were nothing. It's a brilliant question which I have to think about, but I want to think about what that, porosity in the case of the human being is always a relative opening in the end, but the sense of Christ as the absolute porosity, so to say, through whom flows, streams the divine to us and to the divine itself. So I would try to move in directions like that.
David, would you like to respond?
Yes, and I realize time is now short because of the richness of the papers and the lilting graduality of the Irish delivery. And those are wonderful papers. The overarching issue that both of them raised for me had to do with the difference between the sort of analogical understanding of ontology and metaphysics that John and I and others argue for, and how that relates to William's talk of the whole, that is, the picture of the whole that is also that of the transcendence of the whole while still being the whole. But I'll try to get to that maybe in the next session. One footnote on Berkeley worth adding to William's paper is that one of the things I find most useful in reflecting on Berkeley is that part of what he found objectionable about the new sciences and new philosophies of his time was not merely positing a material substrate that's absolutely the inversion of the phenomenal order, which is, of course, for him also is the ideal order, the ideal of the phenomenal being the same in his vocabulary, but the absolute claim that this substrate is the really real, and that the phenomenal order dissembles the real as such, which then renders all immediate knowledge, intuition, all knowledge in act, as not only untrustworthy, but in a very basic sense, misleading, and therefore the understanding of the sciences as practices that delve into occult properties that never emerge into thought or intelligibility, but nonetheless the key to reality as such had taken root, and you get there the same sort of acute question asked in Berkeley that you do get in Hegel, but asked much more simply and more acutely, what then would be the ontological status of the unmanifest? How can we think that? Do we know what we're talking about? And the same sort of pathos you get in the Cappadocian attempt to deal with Eli, or Hule as the Erasmians garble it. Do you understand Eli as actually a property exterior to and therefore opaque to spirit, and therefore as that which never becomes manifest even in the imposition of form? Or do you understand matter already as a function, having that sort of actuality of spirit and being a function of it at its, so to speak, periphery? But that's just, I just wanted to add what you were saying. I guess what I should really refer to is all that wonderful stuff about the Passio Essendi, because actually I have written in that vein, but usually one places that in reflections on ontology, and you're probably right that the tendency, and it's a modern tendency to think through the nature of consciousness, starts from the forward striving of the self towards an end. So a special kind of relation, whether well worked out or not, of will and intellect as the only key, and will as a motive towards a goal. But what's revealed to us about what you would call the Passio Essendi is the sheer fortuity of being, is something that we're attentive to precisely in the moments when the natural will, I'm going to, like Maximus's distinction between the natural and gnomic will, when the natural will is pure of any particular gnomic aspiration. The form of this isn't rational appetite, but but primal astonishment
Right.
at the givenness of being. And herein we have a profound awareness. And I always think in terms of awareness of the contingency of the real, but obviously also it's a profound awareness of the givenness of the soul, how it is given to itself in a knowledge it has not achieved, but that's already there, and an experience of itself as a unified apprehension, as a unity given to itself that it also hasn't achieved.
Yeah.
And this is a contemplative understanding of the soul. I won't surprise anyone who knows me in saying that I think the person who unites these two emphases most successfully is Gregory of Nyssa. But he also invented the internet, as far as I'm concerned, so that's not a surprise. But I won't go on. I mean, I loved what you said, and there's just too much to fit in. I want to, footnotes to Cyril's remarks. I tend to agree with your distancing yourself from Paul Griffith's very powerful advocacy of an Advaita Vedanta view of Christianity earlier today, and not that that's what he was really doing, I know. But there is a danger, if you take that language too far, that you see the fall as an aboriginal alienation from non-duality rather than a sin that breaks communion. And then the danger of that is that the return becomes a tragic nisus of the alone to the alone in the most austere Advaita sense, in which the reverse of a tragic descent is redeemed by a tragic ascent, stripping away of all mediation, otherness, community. So you have to work that out carefully. Yeah, you want to make a distinction between self-referential self-consciousness as a theoretical distance that can mistake itself for representation rather than immediate intuition. But that's not absorption. It's a consciousness that's become more pure because it's more immediate and therefore at not so great a remove. And I don't think Paul would disagree with that, but I don't know, because he's got just an absolutely inexhaustible capacity for perverse formulations.
He's raising his hand.
Well, one last remark then about the inescapability of Hegel. Hegel is annoyingly comprehensive, it's true. And if I had time to lay out the remarks I was going to make about the superiority of an analogical understanding of the relation between time and eternity, I would. I will say this. That same tragic economy is inevitable in Hegel's system simply because of the interminable sacrifice of the particular for the sake of the recuperation of the drama of the idea into the repose of Geist is really quite abysmal. But there's an ontological deficit as well that's every bit as grave, because it just seems to me it doesn't only import the moral scandals of history into the absolute, it also imports the ontological aporias of the contingent into the eternal, no matter how sophisticated it is trying to get around this, because there'll always be inevitably a potentiality and actuality problem that refuses to be resolved into a yet more original simplicity in Hegel. And yet ontologically, that free passage of potentiality to a final actuality, albeit throughout the ironies of history, by deremption and recuperation, nonetheless seems to me to repeat the same ontological dilemma of needing the simple ground to make intelligible the contingency of the movement. But I'm going to stop there because my next move was to talk about sophiology and the world soul, and we'd be here all afternoon.
I'm afraid we are at and even over our time, although...
No, don't let Paul talk. A couple minutes.
I do need to ask Cyril about romanticism, though. This is very, very important. Yeah.
I'll be here at 4.
You'll be at 4?
Yeah,
You'll be here at 4 o'clock? Sorry?
Yeah.
You'll be here at 4 o'clock? No, I'll do it very quick.
You're not going to be here at 4?
Sorry?
Aren't you going to be here at 4?
Oh, we have
We can take
a
it
whole
up.
other session.
We have a whole
Oh,
other
I
session.
see. I'm sorry.
I'll only talk for 30
No,
minutes.
that's fine.
I didn't want to provoke you, so I mean,
I promise, John.
No,
Look,
that's okay.
I'm moderating the last session. I promise I'll call on you.
and call.
It's just call.
That's right, and call. Absolutely. They're 1 and 2.
Okay, we'll defer the last questions to 4 o'clock then, looks like. Thank you.
Right.